Book 4, Mince and Dumplings and the Chocolate Factory. Chapter 1, Mystery Unpacked. It was hard to open the door with the bags of groceries in his hands, not to mention the lit cigarette in his mouth. After a bit of fumbling and a level of finger action that would make Claire Balding proud, Mince opened the door and dumped the bags in the small area at the foot of the stairs. Mince closed the door and picked up the bags once more. He returned a box of 20 Super Kings that had fallen out. This was into the bag, which was stuffed with many other packs of cigarettes. Perhaps groceries was not the best way to describe what he had bought. Mince glided upstairs, stubbed out his cigarette in the ceramic rooster ashtray on the sideboard and unpacked the bags. There was one item wrapped in brown paper that Mince carefully placed in a high kitchen cupboard. Later Mince sat on a perching stool at the kitchen counter. He sat there having a cigarette and a big cup of coffee whilst pondering life and glancing at the kitchen cupboard. He checked his phone and saw a text from Brad and a text from Dumplings. Actually, there were 8 texts from Dumplings, as she was incapable of putting everything she wanted to say in just one message. Mince found it incredibly frustrating. It was impossible to have a text conversation with her, as he never knew when she was finished. His phone could easily buzz away for 30 minutes whilst Dumplings asked simply if he was going to the Wizard's Sleeve or off to the bingo that night. Mince decided to read Brad's message first. A few months of, "You must come up to Brum sometime," without any actual specific offer had worn a bit thin in Mince's opinion. Mince read his messages. Brad 11:23. Hi Mince. How's things? Sorry I've not been in touch for a bit. Just wondering if you wanted to come up to Brum sometime soon? This weekend or the weekend after. Let me know. If not, I'll come down and see you if that's okay with you. It's been too long. Brad. Dumplings 10:30. You know that thing I was saying the other day. Dumplings 10:32. About Mr. Udi and me getting back. Dumplings 10:32. Well, we are not. Dumplings 10:34. Sheila would be well mad now we got the straps let out. Ha. Ha. Dumplings 10:35. But Mr. You gave me this thing. I've always wanted to go. Dumplings 10:38. And now I'm going up. Dumplings 10:42. Thursday. Dumplings 10:42. You. Generally, Mince was good at deciphering a message from Dumplings, but this one had him perplexed. He was a little intrigued. Where was she going on Thursday? Mince got comfy in his favorite chair, put Tipping Point on mute, lined up some Super Kings, had a sip of vodka, ate half a jelly baby, and called Dumplings. A phone call with Dumplings was not for the faint-hearted. She would go into any number of tangents. 2 hours and several Super Kings later, Mince had deduced that, for reasons he still didn't understand, Mr. Udegawa had given Dumplings 2 free tickets to a chocolate factory tour somewhere near Birmingham. She wanted to go up on Thursday as the tour was Friday. Much to his chagrin, Mince had also learned that Sheila and Dumplings were having great success with a new 2-way device. Dumplings had taken the item to a specialist in Brixton who had added extra long straps. Mince decided to bury the mental image as best he could. A couple of days later, Mince met Dumplings at Burger King in Euston Station. Dumplings had insisted that everything was organized and in hand. Mince did not like this. He trusted Dumplings' integrity but not her organizational abilities. Dumplings often maintained that any errors were menopause-induced. She had, however, been exactly the same as long as Mince had known her, which was many years before she had hit menopause. Dumplings showed Mince the train tickets. Mince was impressed before Dumplings confessed that Sheila had sorted it all out. It was taking the train or possibly get a lift with Mr. Udegawa, explained Dumplings, adding, Sheila didn't want me cooped up in a Fiat Panda with a known feeder, so she sorted out the travel and things. Exactly what are the arrangements? Asked Mince before reminding Dumplings that he was also going to see Brad. I'll explain on the train, but Mr. Udegawa has been a bit cagey about where he got the tickets or why he wanted me to come, said Dumplings before gesturing at the upper crust sign and saying that they needed to get some pasties for the trip. On the train, They found their seats and Dumplings stowed her purple carry-on size case with rainbow bright stickers behind the seat. Mince looked in his rucksack, reached in to check on a package wrapped up in brown paper before storing it on the overhead rack. Mercifully, Sheila had booked them table seats opposite each other. The train was getting crowded, and Mince was glad not to have to spend the journey sitting next to one of Dumplings' bingo wings. Mince noticed a man with very greasy hair approaching, and he considered the extent to which using public transport is like Russian roulette. You could end up sat next to anyone. Fortunately, a small nun took the empty seat next to Mince. She was quiet, and, praise be to Cher, didn't smell. An hour into the journey and Mince was irritated. Dumplings kept spitting bits of pastry at him, he didn't like crowds, and most of all he rued the day smoking was banned on trains. Mince kept glancing up to check on his rucksack. Despite a minor delay in the Milton Keynes area and the unacceptable restrictions on smoking, the journey was not too bad. So far no one is dead, joked Mince to Dumplings as they alighted. They were staying the first night in a charming hotel on New Street. Perhaps charming wasn't the word. Well, this is functional, said Mince, glancing at the buzzing fluorescent strip light. They got settled into the very dated and somewhat shabby twin room. Dumplings put her case on the bed whilst Mince checked under his bed for any dead bodies. "It's not mine," screeched Dumplings. Mince turned to look and saw Dumplings looking quizzically at her carry-on size suitcase. "Yes, it is," replied Mince, pointing and adding, "who else would have rainbow bright stickers?" "But my case is purple," explained Dumplings, reminding Mince that this was her favorite color. Mince looked at the case on the bed and it was definitely pink. On closer inspection the stickers were peeling off and were slightly ripped. "Someone has done this deliberately," stated Mince theatrically. The cases were indeed almost identical but for the color difference which now showed clearly under the harsh hotel bedroom lighting. Tentatively, Dumplings opened the case. She held her breath and gradually unpacked. There was a lot of cash, some plus-size lingerie and a bag of fun-size crunches. Mince checked over the case and Dumplings began work on the crunches. "Looks like we have ourselves a West Midlands mystery," said Mince earnestly. Dumplings looked confused but was comforted somewhat by the crunches and the fact that the cash was of a greater value than the contents of her original case. Chapter 2: Death by Chocolate. The plan for Friday morning didn't need adjusting despite the suitcase incident. Dumplings was due to meet Tina to go shopping whilst Mince went on the open-top tour bus. Now the shopping would be more intense as Dumplings actually needed clothes. Mince was useless as a shopping partner, so they had agreed to go their own way for the morning. Now that Dumplings had a big wad of cash, she could really enjoy herself, and she loved shopping with Tina. Dumplings had long considered herself a supporter, if not part of, the BLT community as she called it. Although for most of her adult life she had been an insatiable man-eater, she had a few feminine liaisons over the years. Dumplings felt like she always connected better emotionally with other women. Maybe that was why she was with Sheila now, and maybe it was why she loved Tina so much. Dumplings and Tina first met when Dumplings took a job at a used car dealership. Tina worked in the adjoining garage. Tina was a massive petrol head and due to her Australian accent, she was given the nickname of Bruce by the other mechanics. Of course, when she transitioned, she changed her name and her nickname changed too. Dumplings had been an advocate of the name Tina as they once did it in a Ford Cortina. This was not in the end the name that Tina chose, but Tina stuck as her new nickname. Tina's transition had been a long process, but she was now unrecognizable from the person Dumplings had married. Dumplings often joked that Tina was more feminine than her. Tina was certainly smaller and more petite than Dumplings and now just went under the radar, not that she was ashamed of being trans. It was part of her story and she rightly was proud of who she was. The two women spent the morning shopping and still had enough cash left over for an all-day breakfast at Wetherspoons. Mince joined them. He took a small brown paper packet out of his back pocket before putting it on the table and sitting down. Mince enlightened them to the delights of the bus tour. The only highlight was a glimpse of BBC Pebble Mill, he said. There was still some tension between Tina and Mince. Mince knew in his heart that Dumplings loved Tina more than she did him. Later on, after a short suburban train ride, Mince and Dumplings convened outside of the chocolate factory, which was in a leafy Birmingham suburb. For a second Mince thought he saw their reflection. A large lady and a much thinner man approached. As they got closer, Mince realized it was Mr. Udegawa and a Dumplings clone. He did have a type. "I thought Mr. Udegawa only had 2 spare tickets," said Mince to Dumplings quizzically. "He did, but I said I would only come if you could come too, so he must have bought an extra one," replied Dumplings. She then explained that she didn't want Mr. Udegawa to think that it was a date, so had insisted that she would only come if Mince could come too. Mr. Udegawa was a very smart dresser and had a very kind face. If it weren't for his somewhat unwholesome obsession with voluptuous women, he might have been the perfect gentleman. "This is Dawn, my new wife," said Mr. Udegawa dramatically. "Your wife?" asked Mince and Dumplings in unison. Mr. Udegawa explained that they had gotten married on Wednesday, and Dawn held out her hand to show them the wedding ring. Dumplings was speechless. "Shall we go in?" asked Mince, who was not that interested and wanted to get this over with. They sauntered, minced, and waddled inside and were presented with some complimentary bars of chocolate before being ushered into an audiovisual exhibit about the Aztecs. Mince instinctively handed over his free chocolate to Dumplings, who had just finished hers. Mince realized the close connection between the history of chocolate and the history of tobacco and sat there smiling to himself. There were, unfortunately, a lot of children on the factory tour. Mince regarded these creatures as unhygienic and irritating. The 4 adults continued on with their tour. One part of the tour included a ride in a little train through a land where the cocoa beans were apparently sentient, waving and clearly complicit in their own doom. Dumplings loved it despite the humiliation of squeezing into and out of the little train. Mince tried not to think too hard about the ethics of harvesting a community of self-aware cocoa beans. Later they came into part of the factory where, from a suspended mezzanine, they could look down at big vats of chocolate being stirred by machines. Mince wondered if it was just for show, as anyone could spit over the edge into the vats. Little bars of chocolate were also zipping past them on raised conveyor belts. It was still full of smelly children and irritating parents. Mince noticed a man with very greasy hair further along. "He looks so unhygienic, they should have refused him entry," said Mince to anyone who was listening. What exactly happened next was unclear, but the upshot was the same. In every retelling of the story, Dumplings added more and more detail, and a certain level of inconsistency in her account built up. Mince had been looking the other way. Mince had spotted a fire escape and wondered if he could pop out for a cigarette. The mezzanine had been rather crowded with children, but Dumplings recalled seeing Dawn and Mr. Udegawa having a spot of kissy time high above one of the giant vats of mixing chocolate. The whole structure shook, and part of the railings appeared to give way. Mr. Udegawa clasped a fixed part of the balustrade with one hand and at Dawn's blouse with his other hand. As if in slow motion, Dumplings had witnessed Dawn fall from the broken rails and land in a giant vat of chocolate. Maybe this in itself wouldn't have been too bad, but in a matter of moments, Dawn was stirred into the mixture. She was forced down deeper and deeper until the machinery finally ground to a halt. An alarm was sounding. People were screaming. Mince had decided now was the time for action, so he popped out of the fire escape for a cigarette. As he opened the door, a second alarm sounded, but he hardly cared. Mince took his time outside on the fire escape, waiting for the fuss inside to die down. When Mince went back in, there were fewer people around on the mezzanine, but many members of staff were now on the factory floor. Dumplings was standing by Mr. Udegawa and a member of staff. Dumplings was sobbing almost uncontrollably. Mince, who had not witnessed the full thing, assumed that Dawn fell into a vat of chocolate and climbed straight out. Now he got to the others, he realized the gravity of the situation. Dawn was dead. Her head had been smashed in by a mixer and she had been submerged for a few minutes before they were able to pull her out. "Oh, and all that lovely chocolate is wasted now too," sobbed Dumplings, pointing at the vat. Mince looked and saw a large body covered in chocolate with a pair of blue overalls draped over her face. The body was lying next to a large vat of rapidly solidifying chocolate or fake chocolate. Mince was still not sure which. An hour later, the tour was well and truly over. Nearly everyone had gone. Apart from staff and the police, there was just Mince and Dumplings left, and they had moved back to the benches of the Aztec exhibit. Mr. Udegawa had gone in the ambulance with Dawn's body. "I do sometimes wonder," said Dumplings, scoffing some more complimentary chocolate. "Wonder what?" asked Mince. "Why someone dies everywhere we go," replied Dumplings. As the police were in earshot, Mince thought he had better explain that they were ace amateur detectives, and it was only a coincidence. The police officer, who until this point had considered Mince to be the sensible one, nodded and backed away. "I don't think this is another case for Mince and Dumplings ace amateur detectives," said Mince in a somber tone. "No, this is just a tragic accident," replied Dumplings. Dumplings was meant to go home that night, whilst Mince went to stay with Brad. The police had asked them to come to the police station on Saturday to give a statement and answer some further questions. So they decided that they would both go stay with Brad. On the train back to the hotel to collect their luggage, which they had left at reception, Mince noticed the man with greasy hair sat a few seats up from them. "I keep seeing a man with greasy hair," said Mince to Dumplings. "Well, this is your own private business," replied Dumplings. Mince pondered the matter but didn't say anything further. Chapter 3: Brad, Bath, and Beyond. Well, if it isn't Richard Trevor Longhorn and his associate Louise de Sanchez née Eddingfield, better known as Mince and Dumplings ace amateur detectives, said Brad. He was smiling as he greeted them at the front door of his semi-detached house in Handsworth Wood. They went in. Brad certainly had a nice house, and a flash of jealousy went through Mince's mind before he reminded himself that he had a good-sized maisonette in Zone 2. They had tea in the lounge, which was dominated by a large aquarium and an even larger TV. Mince and Dumplings told Brad what had happened at the chocolate factory and about Dumplings' suitcase. "You must have some ideas then," said Brad. Mince and Dumplings looked back at him blankly. "I mean, who do you think swapped Dumplings' case?" asked Brad. Mince and Dumplings looked back at him blankly. Dumplings explained, again, that the case contained money which was more than compensation for the loss. "Yes, but it sounds like someone stole your original case deliberately," replied Brad, feeling increasingly frustrated. "I did say we had ourselves a mystery," said Mince. "But we wouldn't know where to begin looking for my case," replied Dumplings. She pondered it for a moment and said, "Plus, I was distracted by the crunches." Brad gave Mince a tour of the house. Dumplings watched Bullseye on Challenge TV whilst eating a cheesecake. Dumplings was invited on the house tour but lost interest as soon as stairs were mentioned. Although the house nominally had 3 bedrooms and a room in the attic and the small first-floor room were full of artifacts, so there was only one guest bed. "I tend to keep more legitimate items in the little room," explained Brad. The little first-floor room contained a system of heavy-duty shelves with lockable cages. Inside were many boxes and jiffy bags. Some other items, including golden eggs and some gold watches, were also visible in the cages. Mince wasn't 100% sure what Brad did, but knew it involved moving expensive things across borders without the proper paperwork. Brad pointed at the stairs to the attic, which were behind a locked door on the landing. "Less legitimate items are kept up there," said Brad. Brad explained that Mince couldn't smoke anywhere near the shelves and boxes. Mince looked upset, but Brad pointed out that he had purchased ashtrays specially, which were now placed all over the house. "In fact, I have a surprise for you," said Brad, reaching into a box in the little room and pulling out a giant multipack of Super Kings. Mince smiled. "Would you be able to keep this safe for me?" asked Mince, handing Brad an item wrapped in brown paper. Brad showed Mince the bathroom, which featured a large freestanding bath. Mince thought it would work well for water sports before trying to decide if that would be something he was open to trying again. He decided that smoking in the bath would be a more enjoyable and wholesome activity. Sometime later, having managed another cheesecake before tackling the stairs, Dumplings was safely ensconced in the second biggest bedroom. Mince was in the bath having a cigarette whilst chatting to Brad, who was perched on the edge of the bath drinking a large beer. "Let me get you some shampoo," said Brad, opening a box on the floor full of bottles of some German brand that had "Fur Fettigs Haar" written on the label. Mince's hairline may not have been what it once was, but he was quite pleased to still have a relatively full head of hair. Mince read the back of the bottle and found the part that was in English. He was going to jokingly say to Brad that giving him shampoo for greasy hair was a damn cheek before he made a sudden connection. "It was the same man," said Mince. "Sorry," replied Brad. Mince explained that he had seen the same man with greasy hair on the train from Euston, on the mezzanine at the chocolate factory, and again on the train back into Birmingham city centre. They pondered the matter as Brad dropped his towel, stepped into the bath, and stood over Mince smiling mischievously. On Saturday morning, Mince and Dumplings went to the police station to give their statements. Brad had some other business, but Tina came along for moral support. Dumplings had sent Tina a string of text messages the night before which Tina had more or less been able to decipher. They gave their statements, which were of limited help. Mince had been mostly looking the other way, only had an obscured view and missed half of it when he was outside on the fire escape. Dumplings' account was now that she saw Mr. Udegawa grab the balustrade and kiss Dawn before a section of railings gave way and Dawn fell. Later, Mince, Dumplings and Tina met Brad at Wetherspoons. Tina and Brad had never met before, but realizing that her mechanical expertise could come in handy, Brad turned on the charm. He also found her quite alluring. Mince and Dumplings compared notes. "Did they ask you anything strange?" asked Dumplings. "Actually yes," replied Mince. They had both been uncharacteristically quiet on the short waddle from the police station to the pub. Now they were sat down with food, even Mince, they felt better placed to talk. "They kept asking me if I saw anything unusual, like someone tampering with the guardrail on the mezzanine," said Mince. "They kept asking me about my relationship with Mr. Udegawa," said Dumplings. "Have you seen or spoken to Mr. Udegawa since the accident?" asked Tina. Dumplings explained that she had sent him messages and left voicemail but had not heard anything back. Brad had some business in Croydon on Sunday, so offered to give Mince and Dumplings a lift home if they could wait another day. They agreed. Technically Dumplings had a shift at the Wizard's Sleeve that night, but they owed her a favour after she agreed to stop eating all the crisps behind the bar. Dumplings now relied on her own hostess trolley that she kept at the pub to keep her going on her grueling 3-hour shifts. Admittedly, she was stocking the hostess trolley with food from the pub kitchen, but as she pointed out, she was no longer stealing half as many packets of crisps. "What is there to do in Birmingham for fun?" asked Mince. "There is a chocolate factory tour and an open-top bus tour," replied Brad. "What else?" asked Dumplings. "No, that's it, there are literally only those things to do," Brad advised earnestly. It was decided that Tina and Dumplings would go shopping and that Dumplings would spend that night at Tina's place in Solihull. Mince would stay with Brad, and they would collect Dumplings on the way to London in the morning. "Fancy another go in the bath?" asked Brad to Mince as they left the pub. "Yes, but this time I'm the one drinking the beer," replied Mince, grinning. Chapter 4: The Grease Trap. A couple of days later, back in London, Dumplings was putting in a shift at the Wizard's Sleeve. She had been there about an hour already and was most annoyed when a customer asked her for a Bacardi and iron brew, as it meant getting up off her stool. She could reach many things, not least the crisps, with a long pole with a hook that she had stolen from a hooker duck stall some years previously. Unfortunately, the cans of iron brew were just out of reach. It wasn't that busy given that it was midweek and before noon. There was a group of large lesbians making wind chimes on the big table and a group of taxi drivers at a table in the corner. Some of the taxi drivers were drinking, having finished their shifts, and some were still trying to stay under the limit before starting work. Dumplings knew both groups of people well. Her ability to get on with, and often under, quite disparate types of people was one of the reasons she was able to keep her job. Mince, though lacking in many inhibitions, was still a lot less outgoing than Dumplings. Nevertheless, Mince had also gotten to know many of the taxi drivers that frequented the Wizard's Sleeve over the years. On one occasion Mince had got to know a female taxi driver rather well too. After that incident, which culminated in him sobbing on the floor of Dumplings' flat at 3 in the morning, Mince had sworn off any wine over 12%. Mince arrived just after noon. He glided in and pulled up a stool at the bar. Mince handed Dumplings a Greg's bag and put a parcel wrapped in brown paper on the bar in front of him. "Are they making wind chimes or doing jigsaws this time?" asked Mince, gesturing to the group of large women at the big table. "It's wind chime painting again today," explained Dumplings. She took a bite of her sausage roll out of the Greg's bag and said, "Wolf Sanctuary jigsaws are tomorrow." "You and Sheila should join them," said Mince, teasing Dumplings. "Actually, We are going on an all-female go-karting junket with them next week, replied Dumplings, grinning. As they talked, Mince looked at his reflection in the speckled mirror behind the bar. He also noticed a man sat with the taxi drivers in the reflection. Who is that man with the greasy hair at the table with the taxi drivers? Asked Mince. Dumplings took a not too subtle look and shrugged. Don't think I've had him, she replied. That man is Key, said Mince, reminding Dumplings that Mince had saw him on the train from Euston and at the chocolate factory. They agreed that he must know something. Before Mince could formulate a plan to stalk him, Dumplings had flobbed off the stool and was waddling over to the table in the corner. Mince couldn't hear everything that was being said as someone had put Enya on the jukebox. After a bit of chat and laughter with the taxi drivers, Dumplings came waddling back. I was wrong, but so were you, Dumplings informed Mince. She explained that she had met the man, Keith, before. He used to drive a private hire taxi and had once taken Dumplings and Mr. Udegawa out on a date. She explained that she had indeed also had him on another occasion in the lane behind the pub. Mince thought slightly less of Dumplings on hearing this news. And how was I wrong? Asked Mince. He doesn't have greasy hair, explained Dumplings. Yes he does, replied Mince, now turning to look. He doesn't, it's actually a rather unfortunate hair system, explained Dumplings. He had been bald when he had first met Dumplings, but since then, Keith had been experimenting with spray-on hair and using a lot of gel to keep it in place. He's still Key, said Mince. Yes, he must know something about Mr. Udegawa and Dawn, and maybe even about my suitcase, stated Dumplings. Dumplings had not been able to get in touch with Mr. Udegawa since the factory tour. He says he knows Mr. Udegawa but hasn't seen him for a bit, said Dumplings. She had no idea who to contact to ask about Dawn's funeral. The police would only say that they would be in touch if they needed anything. Mince was right. If they were going to find anything out, Keith was key. They could see that Keith had been drinking, so must have been finished driving his taxi. It was agreed that Mince would follow him when he left the pub, which, as it turned out, was only 20 minutes later. Mince was good at stalking. He followed Keith out the pub, across a small park and towards a medium-rise block of deck-access flats. Mince found a spot in some bushes and watched as Keith climbed the stairs to the third floor and went in the flat, which was the second door along. Mince waited 10 minutes before following. He climbed the stairs and walked past the flat, trying to look inside as he passed the kitchen window, but the blinds were down. Mince looked from the deck and saw a greasy cafe opposite. That would do as a place to wait and to watch. Mince was glad that this was not in the borough in which he had been a health inspector, as looking at the cafe he decided it was best not to know its food hygiene record. Mince sent Dumplings a message to meet him in the cafe and settled himself in with a large coffee and, against his better judgment, a fried egg sandwich. The man working in the cafe had a Middle Eastern appearance and Mince couldn't resist flirting. Unfortunately, he now felt obliged to actually eat some of the greasy food on offer. Just over an hour later, and with no sign of Dumplings or any activity from the flat, Mince felt queasy. It was no good, he was going to have to use the facilities. Frightened that his intermittent prolapse would come back with a vengeance, Mince cautiously minced to the toilets. Not too long after, Mince heard Dumplings coming into the cafe. She shouted for him. "I'm in the trap," Mince shouted back, and Dumplings came into the toilets to talk to Mince through the cubicle door. Mince explained the situation and asked Dumplings to keep an eye on the second door along of the third floor of the block of flats opposite the cafe. Another 30 minutes and Mince came out gingerly and sat down opposite Dumplings. Dumplings was just finishing off a full English breakfast. "Any sign of him?" asked Mince. "No, but I think Mr. Udegawa might live in that block too," replied Dumplings. She went on to explain that she had never been to his flat, but she knew he didn't live far from the Wizard's Sleeve. "It looks very much like he described," said Dumplings, pausing to swallow the last of her toast. They decided the best thing to do was go to Keith's flat and confront him direct. "Please God, I mean Cher, tell me there is a lift," said Dumplings as they left the cafe. Mince was not sure, but as they got closer it became clear that there was a central section with a lift round the back. It was further to walk, but Dumplings preferred that to tackling stairs. She had been at work all of 3 hours and was tired. And she was now full of eggs, bacon, sausage and toast for a very reasonable amount with a pot of tea included. She would definitely be going back to the cafe and wished she had known about it sooner. Dumplings knocked on the door. They could hear some movement inside, and eventually the door was opened by a very sleepy Keith pulling on a pair of tracksuit bottoms as he opened the door. Hello, Dumplings, my dear, and, friend, said Keith, yawning as he looked at them with eyes adjusting to the light. He was now totally bald as he had removed his hair system, and he looked much better for it. May we come in? Inquired Mince, using his most authoritative health inspector voice. Keith shrugged and stood back. They went through to what should have been the living room of a one-bedroom flat but was now Keith's bedroom. Keith knocked some romance magazines off a stool, put the duvet straight and sat on the fold-out bed. Dumplings sat on the stool as best she could, and Mince stood. What's this all about then? Asked Keith. How do you know Mr. Udegawa, and when did you see him last? Asked Mince. Keith paused, unsure of how to proceed. He was clearly considering different options in his head. Keith went on to explain that he had rented a room from Mr. Udegawa for the past few months and had been doing some odd jobs for him. I'd better let you see for yourself, said Keith, getting up and leading them to the main bedroom. He gave the door a shove and it swung open. Mince and Dumplings followed Keith into Mr. Udegawa's bedroom. Mr. Udegawa's bedroom was essentially a shrine to Dumplings. The walls were covered in photos and paintings of Dumplings. Some photos were clearly taken with a long-range lens and the paintings were quite explicit. There was also quite a collection of large-size lingerie pinned to the walls and other bits and pieces from Dumplings' flat placed about the room. I've been looking for that, said Dumplings, picking up a little mermaid mug with her lipstick still on the rim. He must have been collecting this stuff for months, observed Mince. Keith reached under the bed and retrieved Dumplings' original suitcase. I swapped the cases, as instructed, but I haven't opened this one, explained a somewhat embarrassed Keith. He went on to tell them that he had been helping Mr. Udegawa commit various acts of fraud and extortion. This had mostly involved him witnessing whiplash injuries at busy junctions. Also, on several occasions Keith had deliberately removed caution slippery surface signs to allow Mr. Udegawa to follow behind, fall and sue. He always seemed so nice, said Dumplings. Keith explained that Mr. Udegawa's requests had gotten more bizarre recently, culminating in asking him to swap Dumplings' suitcase on the train. He said it was part of a surprise in which he wanted you to have a brand new wardrobe before eloping with him to Hawaii, advised Keith. Elope with him? What about Dawn, his wife? Replied Dumplings, now visibly quite angry. His wife? I didn't know they were married, replied Keith. He pondered it for a moment and then said, I thought it was just business. I think the plan is that she gets 50% of the compensation money, and you, Dumplings, and Mr. Udegawa elope to Hawaii. What about me? Said Mince, also now quite angry. You can't leave me to go to Hawaii. Mince stated loudly. I'm not going to Hawaii with Mr. Udegawa, shouted a frustrated Dumplings. Anyway, what about Dawn? Said Dumplings in a much calmer voice. Yes, how is she? Asked Keith, explaining that he was surprised not to have heard from Mr. Udegawa since Friday. Well, she's dead, stated Dumplings. Mince and Dumplings explained what had happened to Dawn. The colour drained from Keith's face. But it was all planned. Dawn was a professional compensation injury artist. At least that is what Mr. Udegawa said Keith as he looked round the room. All I did was to loosen a couple of bolts as instructed, moaned Keith. I waited outside the factory and saw the ambulance and things, but I didn't realize that all this had happened, said Keith, now sitting on Mr. Udegawa's bed trembling. Mince looked at Dumplings and Dumplings looked at Mince. This looks like another successful case for Mince and Dumplings, ace amateur detectives, they said in unison. Keith looked at them, then started crying. Epilogue. Mr. Udegawa looked up from the dock of Courtroom 5 and saw Mince and Sheila sat in the gallery. But there was no sign of the woman he wanted to see. He was sad and annoyed that she was not there to see him acquitted. Even though she had given evidence against him, Mr. Udegawa knew that she was and always would be the one. The trial had been quite long, and mostly hinged on the life insurance policy that Mr. Udegawa had taken out on Dawn. Keith had reached a bargain with the authorities to admit to his involvement. As Keith thought it was all for a compensation scam and not life insurance fraud, it was hard to prove premeditated murder on his part. The jury came back in, and things started to settle down. Mr. Udegawa looked up at Mince and Sheila again. He hated them. They had been trying to poison his beloved against him. Then Dumplings came back into the gallery and sat between Mince and Sheila. Brad and Tina were sat behind. The foreman of the jury was instructed to advise if they had reached a verdict. They had. It was unanimous. On the charge of murder, the defendant was found guilty. The word echoed round the room. Mr. Udegawa looked puzzled. He had admitted to the compensation scam, but how could they have known what he had planned? Anyone could have Googled, "How long does it take to drown in chocolate?" or "How long do you have to wait after one wife dies before you can marry the next?" for perfectly innocent reasons. The fact that he had made several visits to the chocolate factory with a tape measure before Dawn's death just showed how much he enjoyed going. They didn't even find out about the tickets to Hawaii. He would appeal. The judge passed a life sentence and instructed that the murderer be taken down. Mr. Udegawa looked up into the gallery. "I did it all for you, Louise," shouted Mr. Udegawa before realizing that made him sound guilty, so then he shouted, "The compensation fraud, that is, I did it all for you." The courts were in Birmingham city centre. Mince and Dumplings had been staying with Brad, and Sheila had stayed there a few times too. The gang went to Wetherspoons. After Brad and Mince ordered the food and got the drinks in, Mince put a small parcel wrapped in brown paper on the table. "I have something shocking to tell you all," said Mince. He started to unwrap the parcel and explained that he had given the matter a lot of thought and had decided to stop smoking. He unwrapped a vape and looked up to see the reaction on his friends' faces. Tina was busy on her phone. Sheila looked at Dumplings and shrugged. Brad and Dumplings both looked back at Mince and said, "Thanks, Cher, for that." "Actually, I have some news too," said Tina, putting down her phone. "He will be here any minute now," she added. Not much longer, and the food came. Not much longer after that, a very handsome man approached the group smiling. Mince and Dumplings' jaws dropped. It was Marvin from Senegal, the only man that had ever come between them. He was stunning and had been way too good for Mince or for Dumplings. Marvin sat down. "Mince, Dumplings, I haven't seen either of you for a long time," said Marvin, and he held Tina's hand and kissed it. "So, I hear you solved another mystery," continued Marvin. "Yes," replied Mince, still in a state of shock. Dumplings took a swig of Stella, wiped her mouth and began to tell Marvin everything that had happened. This took a while. "Well, that certainly does sound like another successful case for Mince and Dumplings' ace amateur detectives," laughed Marvin. "I promise you that I am not marrying Tina for any ulterior motives," said Marvin ominously. Mince and Dumplings' jaws dropped again. Maybe Marvin would be good for Tina and maybe not. Time would tell. The important thing was that Mr. Udegawa was behind bars, Mince was quitting smoking, and Dumplings had finally gotten to visit a chocolate factory.